La, la, la. Welcome once again to the Letterman podcast with Mike Chisholm. My name is Mike Chisholm, and I am very excited as always. Broken record. That is how I start every episode of pretty much every podcast, even my other podcasts that I do. I talk about how excited I am to be doing this. I feel like I found I don't know what you want to call it. We can get whimsical and call it a life's purpose or a calling, but something I enjoy very, very much. It's like somebody who's, maybe their destiny is to become a bowler, whether it's part-time or full-time or rec time. And then they bowl for the first time and they realize how amazing it actually is. That's kind of how I feel about being a podcast host. And certainly, if there was any podcast content that I would broadcast about, it is David Letterman and Company. And it's happening. And so many good things are happening, including this. The Letterman podcast is brought to you in part by the Hello Deli. Rupert and May at the Hello Deli. Just so grateful for their support of this show. So great to be able to support them back. Hey, listen, did you ever have one of them Late Show with David Letterman mugs and maybe it fell off the counter? Maybe the kid broke it. Oh my gosh. Grand larceny, someone stole it. Holy smokes. Guess what? You can go to hello-deli.com and you can replace that mug. One of the only places on earth to buy Late Show with David Letterman merchandise is the Hello Deli, which, by the way, resides right inside the superstructure of the Ed Sullivan Theater. And he's got shirts, phenomenal pricing. He's got shirts of the Hello Deli, of Rupert, as well as Late Show with David Letterman merchandise. Head on over there and check it out and grab some stuff. If you're in New York, go to the Hello Deli, have a meal, see Rupert, buy a t-shirt, all of that stuff. We are so proud to have them as a sponsor for us, in partnership with them in that regard. It's an incredible thing. Now, today's episode is going to be, by the way, our very first returning guest. So there you have it. We're 12 episodes into this thing. Daniel Kellison just dropped at the time of this broadcast. We've got Arthur Kelly in the can and a couple other little things as well. But we haven't had a returning guest yet. So I guess it'll be, 13 or 14 episodes in total before Rob Cates has come back. And if you remember, Rob Cates runs a whole bunch of different tribute sites, enthusiast sites on Facebook, or as a part of a whole bunch of them to do with the Rat Pack with tens of thousands of members. And then between all of his other ones, tens of thousands of members to do with comedy, late night especially, and of course the David Letterman fans Facebook group. And I just, again, I was talking about this with somebody last night, how people who work in television just appreciate the work of David Letterman and Company. We're going to go deep on that in a future episode for sure, why that is the case. We think it's subliminal that Dave came up old school. He was in the radio studio, in the television studio, knew how to do everything. And when he broke that fourth wall, those are the types of people who he featured on the show. And it's just very cool to see that. I've had some experience in community television, and I think that there's a bit of a communal thing happening there, but that's not what today's episode is about. Rob is coming on. We're going to do a post-mortem today, and I'm very excited that it's Rob that I'm doing this one with. If there was an episode of My Next Guest that I've watched more than any other episode, and by the way, I mean, we have maybe I'll start with this with Rob. Those of us who are enthusiasts of things, we'll watch things multiple times, some of us. And if there's an episode that I've watched more than any other one, it's the one we're going to discuss today, featuring the gentleman that we're going to discuss. Of course, it goes beyond just his My Next Guest appearance, but his My Next Guest appearance was landmark, and it's Jerry Seinfeld. And Rob and I today are going to discuss Jerry Seinfeld. We're going to discuss the Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, as well as my next guest and wherever else the conversation is going to take us. The postmortem of Jerry Seinfeld with my very special guest, Rob Cates. Thank you so much for coming back. You had so much fun the first time. You jumped into the breach again. Thank you so much for coming back to be on the Letterman podcast, buddy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. Yeah, as you said, I'm your first return guest. So I'm honored to do that and honored to talk about Dave and Jerry Seinfeld. I mean, two of my comedy heroes, and I know that they're two of your very favorites too. So I just love seeing Dave and Jerry together on my next guest and also on Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee.
Yeah, it's I'm great. I'm so glad that it's you that I'm talking to about this, because we are both very, very much enthusiasts of both men, of the science of comedy itself, the evolution of comedy, all of those things. And I think that it's very safe to say that these episodes and many times that Jerry and Dave interact with each other, this is one of those episodes that, as far as if there was a love letter to us enthusiasts, I would think that is the episode. That is those two episodes that we're talking about here today. But the my next guest specifically were Jerry Seinfeld. It looked to me like it was an audience of Netflix employees. I don't know about you, but that's what it looked like to me. But Jerry Seinfeld interviewing or attempting to interview David Letterman on Dave's own show. Incredible episode, to say the least. And we got lots of meat on that bone to talk about today. I could talk about, the episode itself is 40 some odd minutes. I could talk about this episode for hours because of the tidbits and some of the things that were said and maybe also unsaid as well.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And I think it was probably Netflix employees, and I think it was at the Netflix headquarters at one of their studios in LA. And of course, they dove into when they first met, and Jerry and Dave thought that they met at the Comedy Store originally. And I thought it was interesting how Jerry was talking about how he was able to do Dave's show and Johnny Carson's show. So he was that appealing of a comedian that he could appeal to Dave's audience as well as Johnny's audience. And that didn't happen a lot. Often you had Dave guests and you had Johnny guests, and they didn't often intertwine. But that was an interesting point that Jerry made about that.
Yeah, and going into the the sensibility of both shows and how Dave pointed out that there were limits put on to, because Late Night with David Letterman was a Carson property. It was Johnny Carson's. I probably, as a result of one of Johnny's legendary contract re-ups, the idea that 1230 became his baby, or at least his production company, had a massive stake and say in the content that was following him. I've also heard things over the years about how Johnny had a say in Saturday Night Live and things like that as well. And because of that, restrictions put on late night as to what it potentially, what it could not be, certain types of music that was played. Dave didn't do a monologue opening, they were called opening remarks, things like that. Those limitations really helped shape what late night became. And as you pointed out, comedians, very rare crossover. And we've heard rumblings of that. I know you've watched all of our other Letterman podcast episodes. Tom Dreesen talked about that a little bit as well, like with Jay Leno, and how Jay Leno was on the Tonight Show. And then there was a time, Tom's reasoning for it blew me away, why Jay kind of stopped being on the Tonight Show. And then David Letterman picked that up and had Jay pretty much exclusively on late night for a lot of appearances, dozens of appearances. And then Jay goes back and starts guest hosting, things like that. Jerry, a guy who could go between both shows. And I love Dave's reaction to that. Like, Dave, this is a quintessential episode that shows, in my opinion, it's attempted compliment ping pong is this episode. Every time Jerry tried to compliment Dave, deflection. And many times when Dave would compliment Jerry, deflection. And it was just very interesting how Jerry would talk about, I was very proud about being the guy that could go walk between two worlds of the Tonight Show, Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, and Late Night with David Letterman. And Dave was just like, oh, it was a bit of a curiosity for him, does not acknowledge the cultural significance of that. And I found that very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I agree, definitely. And yeah, it's just was amazing to, as you said, it's like the two comedic giants kind of complimenting one another back and forth. And just to hear Dave, I love Dave talking about early in his career, he did a few things in Indianapolis. He was a weatherman there and did a little bit of dabbling in broadcasting in Indianapolis, but he knew that what he had to do was to move out to California, perform at the Comedy Store for a while, and get noticed by somebody from Johnny Carson show and get on Johnny's show. And that's back then, that's how you made it. That's how you made it in show business. That was like a clear road to how to make it in TV and comedy. And also it's interesting how Dave didn't really want to be a stand-up, but he knew that that was the route that he had to take. Unlike Jerry, always wanted to be a stand-up comedian. That's what he wanted to do. But Dave knew he wanted to be on television. He wanted to be involved in that world, but being a stand-up was not the main thing that drove Dave. And he was a broadcaster, but stand-up was his avenue to get into television.
I understand this as well. I've been doing stand up a little bit this year since the pandemic has kind of released its ugly claws on humanity. I've been doing it not because I think I am overly funny, not because I'm aspiring to be a stand up, but and a big part of it, Rob, is because of this episode. Dave saying, I knew I had to do it. It wasn't my end game by any stretch of the imagination. I needed to have that skill set down, as in his repertoire. That's why he did it. And I think that right there, people always, compare Jay Leno and David Letterman, and Jay Leno, I think, is more like Jerry Seinfeld in the fact that he wants to be the stand-up comedian, the quintessential stand-up comedian, the guy, the joke machine, and he and Jerry are very similar that way. But like you said, and as we talked about in the intro, Dave had spent so much time in TV studios and knew every aspect of it, from the booth announcing all the way up, and in a time where many times you have to be a jack of all trades to do that. He was fascinated by that. We had Jeff Altman on the podcast not too long ago, and he talked about how Dave went out to California with the aspiration of being a writer as well. It wasn't he didn't go out there to be a stand-up, but he knew to get to where he wanted to go. Even Dave in this episode where Jerry, again, it's Jerry attempting to interview David Letterman, where Dave says, oh, I knew I had to do it. And he says tongue in cheek, and that would get me to the Tonight Show, and by God, then they'll give it to me. I loved that line. I loved when Dave said that. That was just hilarious because it's tongue in cheek, but it's also kind of what happened.
It really is. Yeah. Dave was able to follow that route, and not everybody was able to do that, and not everybody at the Comedy Store was always impressed with the same type of comedians. I mean, Jerry talked about how Mitzi Shore, the owner of the Comedy Store, the mother of Pauly Shore, Mitzi was not that impressed with Jerry, and so it was really not the big break for Jerry. And Jerry was more of a New York comic, but he tried his hand in LA. But that route doesn't always work out exactly for people, but it did. Luckily, it did for Dave, and and then you can look at Jay, and as you said, Jay is like the quintessential stand-up, and people bash Jay Leno, and I'm not going to bash Jay Leno, but he is an outstanding comic, and Dave has said that Jay is like the ultimate comic. Dave was so impressed with Jay at the Comedy Store, and he still is. But I was not crazy about Jay as a late night host, but he's a great comic, And I think that his passion is really cars. And so his show on CNBC is excellent. I think Jay Leno's Garage is really a great fit for him, because that's really his passion, is talking about cars, and his garage is amazing, and all of that. So I think that show really works for Jay Leno, because that is his true calling.
Sure. Without a doubt. I mean, without a doubt, that is, we talked about when somebody realizes something that is their calling in life, or whatever you want to call it. Jay is definitely living his best life hosting that show. The one thing, talking about Jay and talking about this episode of My Next Guest, back in the day when you would watch Jay Leno and David Letterman go back and forth when Jay would guest, do panel with Dave, the back and forth was amazing. I think Dave was always at his best when somebody in the opposite chair was smart and funny, and quick. I mean, if there's a third attribute, that would probably be it. This episode of My Next Guest, where again, it's Jerry Seinfeld attempting to interview David Letterman. I say the word attempting because whenever somebody tries to interview Dave, the questions on Dave's side start coming out, because Dave will either answer a question with a question, or he'll start, getting fascinated with the other person. And it is a natural curiosity. He's also very good at it. And I find it interesting, the parallels between the two, because when in this episode of My Next Guest, it kind of did remind me a little bit of when Jay would be on Dave's show a little bit, even though Jerry was trying to interview him, many times that back and forth would lead places that perhaps weren't scripted or ready to go, from the get-go in the pre-interview, that kind of a thing. And I don't think Jerry and Dave did a pre-interview here, but I think that Jerry did what very few people do. Number one, he was able to compliment Dave, and almost successfully. And number two, he was actually able to get some things out of Dave as Dave was making the interview back about Jerry again.
Sure, that is true. Yeah, and yeah, it was like Jerry was trying to interview Dave, but then Dave interviews Jerry, and back and forth. And yeah, and I thought that one of the key parts of the show was when Dave was talking about, hey, sometimes I wish that I had stepped down a bit earlier, and sometimes I had wished that I had done some things to help the world, is basically what he said. And he's, as we know, Dave is very humble. It's hard for him to take compliments. But I thought it was key that Jerry came back and he was like, no, Dave, you have done enormous things to help the world. I mean, you have brought comedy to people for decades. You have brought light into the world and entertainment. And he asked Dave, did you intend to change television? And Dave was like, oh, he has trouble taking compliments. But I thought that was really a key part of the show when you think about what Dave does for a living, and also what Jerry does for a living, and entertainers in general. They bring humor into the world. They bring lightness into the world, which, as we know lately, can be kind of a tough place to be. I mean, it's kind of a dark time for the world right now, but I don't think that you want to downplay that. And I know that when I look at my life, a lot of my happiness in the world has come from entertainment. It's come from television. It's come from movies, music, and things like David Letterman show and Jerry Seinfeld show. So those people really have helped a lot of people, and they've made a difference in the world. And so it was interesting that Jerry brought that perspective. And I know that Jerry's a transcendental meditation kind of guy. So I don't know if that plays any role into his outlook in the world, but it's really interesting to hear Jerry's outlook on things in general. And so that was a big point for me. And the title of the show is "You're David Letterman, you idiot." And that's what Jerry said to Dave, basically. You're David Letterman. Look at what you have done in the world. Look what you have accomplished. And it's huge. And he's basically saying to Dave, you don't want to discount that. You don't want to downplay what you've done really to make the world a better place.
You bring up all sorts of tangents that we could go off of. I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that Jerry has done so much self-reflection, and whether it's through TM or whatever it is, where he knows himself very, very well. Because some people have said that Jerry Seinfeld comes off as arrogant. I don't see that at all. I see him coming off as somebody who is a master. He is masterful in not just stand-up comedy. He is of course a master at that, but I think in many ways he's also a master at points of view, and the point of view of being. He's not being arrogant when he says that we have brought a lot of joy to the world, or he's saying it today, but he's also saying it himself. This is what we do. It's not a selfish pursuit, even though it feels good. It's not a selfish pursuit, because he actually uses the phrase, we go through hell to entertain, and the fact that he brought that up, and they do, like both these men in the shows that they created went through hell. If you look back at all of the the footage and documentaries and things like that about what it was like when Seinfeld was being made and produced and released, there's lots of I think about back to Jerry Seinfeld and Gary Shandling, how they had shows across the lot from each other, and they would just sometimes have to meet across the lot from each other and pull their hair out in front of each other, because they go through hell to put smiles on people's faces. Not a selfish pursuit, and he sees that for what it is, not arrogantly, but for the fact that it is, it's not charitable, but it's generous to do that for people. And that is something that Dave seemingly accepted in that moment on the show. And you don't normally see Dave accepting things like that.
Mm-hmm. That is true. Yeah. Because I think Jerry put things into a different perspective for him. Yeah. And I knew that this was something that you'd be interested in because of your, I know that you had the podcast that's about men's mental health. And so this is really ties into psychology and life and what makes us happy, what brings us pleasure. Yep. And watching David Letterman or watching Jerry Seinfeld, or it can be watching a Broadway show or going to a great concert. And myself, I know a lot of people feel the same way. I have great respect for people who work in the arts, people who are actors, actresses, dancers, singers, comedians. And as you said, it's a tough road. People who work in the arts, they have so many barriers, and they have to face rejection, and it's a tough way to make a living. But if you're good enough, and if you have the stick-to-itiveness and the persistence to do it, you can become somebody like Dave or Jerry and really make a huge impact on the world.
Well, you bring up a couple things that I definitely want to talk about, both here and in the future. First off, the art comment that you just made, absolutely. I think that sometimes those of us who are, we publicly come out about how large an enthusiast we are about whatever art it is. For us, comedy, late night, Letterman specifically, we come out and talk about that. But really, at the end of the day, you look at video games, which is an interactive experience. You look at movies, all the streaming platforms, content that's out there, whether it's podcasts, whether it's movies, whether it's long form, short form series, comedy, drama, whatever. All of that in the human being experience, that is in our culture of today, broadcast date in 2022, that is human beings responding to art. We're responding to the commercial versions of art. How many visual artists are having shows at alternative galleries or limited galleries out there because they're just trying to get what's inside them out, and then somehow try and marry it to commerce if they can. And like you said, an incredibly difficult pursuit, whether it's music, whether it's visual arts, whether it's performing arts of whatever genre. This is what we're talking about here. And I think many times these large commercial versions of this, which attract a lot of people, but many times it gets divided because of the business, because of what entertainment is. Many times we forget that this is the exact same version of the person that's painting watercolors just to get it out of them and displaying it, hoping that somebody might buy one so they can just paint more watercolors. And that's what the arts is. And these guys, when it comes down to it, I think that gets disguised because of the commercial aspects of it, because they've made as much money as they have and as much success as they have, and put it out there the way that they do. It muddles the idea that actually this is just like that. This is a piece of art.
Mm-hmm. It is a piece of art. And it's, yeah, Jerry talked about how he was doing what he thought was funny. And of course he would check with Larry David, and basically if the two of them agreed that it was funny, they would do it. They put it out there. And we know that millions of people felt exactly the same way. And I'm sure Dave was the same way too. Dave, with his small group of people, they would talk about things in the writers' rooms, and this would be funny or this wouldn't be funny. And so that was their goal, to entertain, and that's what they did. And it is interesting to think about the parallels between Dave and Jerry. And yeah, both of them had such groundbreaking impacts on television and on culture and on the world in general.
Oh man, again, I want to go back to the mental health thing in a second here, but just every time you bring up another point, it's so I love it, because again, this is that compliment ping pong right here, the groundbreaking part. Jerry saying to Dave, "Did you intend to revolutionize TV?" And Dave just wouldn't even have it. The only way you get the compliment through to Dave is if he turned it into almost a little bit of deprecation. Did you intend to change television forever? Oh, stop. Okay, but I'm not going to say you did it for the better. And Dave was like, okay, I'll accept that. But then Jerry, oh God, this was the best thing in the entire world, because I love when Dave accepts a compliment. He accepted it from Seinfeld right here and what we're talking about. And he accepted it from Chappelle when Chappelle was on My Next Guest. Because I think sometimes when somebody is such a credible source, a giant in the business, Dave has no choice but to begrudgingly accept it. And so Seinfeld sets up this, I don't know if he did it on, this almost felt premeditated. Like, I'm going to compliment Dave whether he likes it or not today. Did you intend to change TV for the better? No. And he's like, I'm not going to say for the better. And Dave immediately agrees and says, oh, okay, yeah. And then Jerry brings it back and says, yeah, I'm not going to say for the better, because the people who are pale, cheap imitators of what you did have not made television a better thing, which kind of brings it back going, oh God, okay. It wasn't deprecating at all. It was in fact even more complimentary. I just thought that was amazing. I want to go back to the mental health thing for a second, just before we get too far away from it, because Jerry addresses this. This is going to be a subject. We, like I said, just had Jeff Altman on the show here, and Jeff and I have become friends outside of this, and he's very interested in the men's mental wellness podcast that I do. And he's going to come on and he's going to talk about it. We're going to talk about depression. We're going to talk about, some of these, some of these things that aren't in vogue to talk about, but at the same time affect so many of us. That's going to be a great conversation. Now, Jerry touches on that in this episode, and bread trucks is funny. Bread trucks alone is just a funny way of illustrating the point that Jerry says. He does not agree with the idea, and it is a stereotypical idea. I can't wait to talk about this with Jeff. There's an idea out there that comedians are broken mentally or have some sort of mental illness or mental deficiency and all that. And Jerry, again, talking, you brought up how well he knows himself, the meditation, the self-reflection, all of that stuff, takes exception to that. and says, you know what, it's just like, it's not that every comedian is broken. It's just like bread truck guys. There's going to be some that are and some that aren't. It's not an indicative of the profession. And that is a very interesting concept that I think will become more important as mental health and mental wellness, I think, becomes more of a focal point in our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. You can't look at, okay, all comedians have mental challenges or anything like that, but yeah, some of them do. But the thing, yeah, that's true with any profession. And yes, you do hear about mental health with comedians because they are in the public eye. And if something happens, like with Robin Williams ending his life, we hear about that because he was a public figure and everyone knew who Robin Williams was. But it's good in a way because it brings light into that subject and it does get people talking about that. And yeah, definitely men's mental health it's not anything to shy away from. It's fine to talk about it. It's fine for men to talk about their feelings and to talk about if they're having struggles or if they're not feeling that well or things like that. It doesn't have to do with the old school people might think, oh, you're not a real man if you talk about your feelings. It's not about that. It's really not. It's everybody has feelings and everybody has challenges. And but we can talk about people like Dave and Jerry who have brought light into the world and they are able to bring some humor and some happiness into our world and make things better.
Well, and this isn't an episode of HeCast, but what you're talking about very well could make it that way, because yeah, I mean, I have on the other show, I've got life coaches and counselors and all these sorts of people that talk about this and talk about vulnerability. And how vulnerability is a silver bullet. Awareness about this stuff, being able to admit it a little bit that you're not feeling all right if you're not. And so many men don't do that, and we bottle it up. And it's just that simple act of getting it out there is part of the solution. I think comedians many times, like I think about a guy like Neil Brennan, and I mean, oh my God, if you haven't watched Neil Brennan's Three Lights special on Netflix, a phenomenal special. And I highlight him because he's very public about it. I'm not outing anything or anything. The whole entire special was kind of built around his progression. Comedians, they get up there and they are vulnerable in so many ways. And that is I think many times comedians that may have these types of things, well, guess what? They get up on stage and they start working that shit out. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. The compliment thing, I think, is really interesting though, because again, I want to go back not to how Dave accepted that compliment, but let's go to Jerry for a second, because Dave tried to do the same thing to Jerry and say, okay, well, the most groundbreaking, and this is a cool aside too. I love how rock and roll Dave is, and I love how much Dave loves music. I adore that. That is a subject we're going to be talking about on the Letterman podcast moving forward for sure. And who he cited when he was complimenting Jerry on his situation comedy, his epic situation comedy, Seinfeld. He goes back to a Rolling Stone article. Rolling Stone calls your show the most groundbreaking or the greatest, whatever the quote was. And again, Jerry he had a hard time accepting that. Even though he is so self-reflective, Jerry's got a little bit about what Dave does in the compliment department as well.
Yeah, he does. He has trouble taking compliments. I mean, I guess, yeah, people do struggle with, they want to be confident, but yet at the same time, you don't want to be cocky, but yet people like Dave and Jerry, they really do need to acknowledge what they've done in the world. And yeah, Jerry talked to Dave about changing television, and Dave said the same thing about Johnny Carson. I remember watching the PBS American Masters series, the program about Johnny Carson, which was just fascinating. People really need to check that out. And one of the first quotes was from David Letterman, and he said Johnny was the gold standard, and Johnny determined how things would be in late night, and everyone following Johnny was just trying in vain to be as great as he was.
Yep.
And Jerry basically said the same thing to Dave. Dave, you are really the standard maker, and everyone following you is just a pale imitation, and they can't compare to you.
Yeah, well, and that's how I feel. I know that's how you feel. It's so ironic to me. Not even crazy. Crazy is the wrong word. It's ironic to me that somebody who is revered by so many, and again, it takes a guy like Chappelle or Seinfeld to even get Dave publicly to even fathom accepting or hearing the compliment. But that is exactly who Dave is. He changed everything and had such a huge impact. And when you get a giant like Jerry Seinfeld saying that, it carries a lot of weight. And Johnny Carson did that for Dave, but Dave finds it seems like he finds it impossible to believe that there are guys like you and I saying, well, Dave did that for us. Dave totally did that. I found it fascinating, on along this vein, where Dave talked about how there were moments where part of the decision that they had to make, and this is where you alluded to this earlier, where Jerry had Larry David, and if they found it funny, it was all good. But Dave opened up and was a little bit vulnerable and said, okay, well, we had pieces of comedy where our decision was how far outside the norm into the bizarre or whatever do we take it versus staying mainstream, with the danger of isolating the audience or separating ourselves from the audience just because it was really funny to us. And I think he used the word bizarre, and I was really glad to hear him say that. I love how bizarre, quote unquote, and experimental, I think that's an even better word, that late night was. And it was really cool to hear Dave acknowledge it. You don't hear that very often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, and probably part of that comes from his time slot. I think that when you have the 12:35 a.m. Eastern show, I think that they have more freedom to do some different and bizarre things in that time slot. And the earlier time slot gets all the glory. People talk about the 11:35 Eastern time slot, but you look at really what Dave did at 12:35. You look at what Conan O'Brien did. You look at Tom Snyder, or you look at James Corden.
Ferguson.
And I think that a lot of credit needs to go to those people that have been in the later time slot and some of the groundbreaking things that they have done.
Well, without a doubt, Dreesen talked about that on our episode too, and how Dave would be doing things on late night, and Carson. He talked about how I love this, and people are saying you should isolate this out of the Dreesen episode and throw it out there because it's not talked about enough. How Dave helped keep Johnny hip because of some of the things that he was doing at 12:30. They're linked up. You got a mentor mentee. When Dave became hotter than anybody in America, he's still coming on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Just how pissed are you? That moment, and not just that, but the remotes that they did together, and how Carson actually, lifted some of the things that Dave was doing. We've had quite a few people actually comment to us about that. I think that's something that's going to be neat to explore. Carson's not around to be, to respond to it, but it's from a historical standpoint, and that's where many of us sit. Is we love the history, we love watching the evolution of it. The 11:30 guy many times keeps the 12:30 guy, I should say, keeps the 11:30 guy more hip because of that creative range. I think about Craig Ferguson. He had a guy, a two-man horse team and a robot skeleton and all these things. You don't get a chance to do that in the mainstream slot at 11:30. You just don't.
Mm-hmm. That is true. Yeah. So you got to think about how is the 11:35 guy impacting the other guy and vice versa. And as you said, the 12:35 guy keeps the 11:35 guy hip and young and fresh and doing some new things, or if you even look at Arsenio Hall
Oh
and
yeah.
how he affected Johnny Carson too. I mean, Johnny, a lot of people tried to take down Johnny. Arsenio was the young, fresh guy, really doing hip things, and
Mhm.
Johnny kind of felt those footsteps. And there's a great Saturday Night Live skit called Carcenio,
Yes.
and it's Johnny Carson trying to be young and trying to be like Arsenio. And I guess Johnny did not like those SNL skits, but I found them to be really, really funny. And yeah, so Carcenio was Johnny trying to appeal to a hip young audience, and he and Ed McMahon trying to act young. It was really funny. It was a funny skit.
It was brilliant. Dana Carvey's Johnny Carson was brilliant. And again, if we look at this from a straight up understanding that we revere Johnny Carson and there is no disrespect intended, absolutely hilarious. The reality being that Dave helped keep Johnny hip, and you know, the idea, and that was where, you know, Carson really, I've read many of the same things, that it was sketches like that, Arsenio changing the landscape, and then also the idea we've talked about this a little bit in our community, the Letterman podcast community. We've talked about this a little bit, and people have reached out and talked about this too. You know, many of these talk show hosts, one of the things that floats their boat, or seemingly floats their boat, is the idea that there are people they revere, you know, from a different part of show business, and they have those people on. And as those people start to leave the world, you know, talk about the Jack Bennys of the world and people like that for Johnny's giants, the people Johnny Carson would call giants, as they start to leave the world, you know, the talk show host at that point has to either change or they get less interested. One of the things that I love about Dave is that, yes, you know, guys like Carson and Sinatra and Rickles and these guys have passed on, but Dave has a fascination and a curiosity for the gigantic stars of the day today. You know, you think about my next guest, and we're gonna at some point have somebody on to do a postmortem with about the Billie Eilish episode. And it's Dave has a curiosity about these people who are becoming larger than life now, that I just don't believe Johnny Carson really had at the end. I think that's a big part of it too. It's interesting to see Johnny in his 60s and 70s and Dave in his 60s and 70s. And that is a major hallmark difference between the two, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. That is true. And some people have been critical of Dave, and some people do say, why is he having Billie Eilish on the show, or Kim Kardashian, or Lizzo, or people like this? But yeah, I agree with what you said. Dave is being relevant to what's going on today. But at the same time, sure, I want to see him have Steve Martin on the show, or Martin Short, or people like that. But also the thing is, Dave himself is so engaging and just such a great interviewer, and he turns people on to these people that they may not know about. And a lot of people, especially in my generation, they don't know who Cardi B is.
Yep.
But you see Dave interview her, and you find out about her background, and you find out that there's a lot more to her than you might think. I mean, she's talking about presidential history, and, you know, Cardi B talking about Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR and her appreciation for them. And Dave was able to bring that out.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we're talking about this, because the people who criticize, they miss the point. This is Dave kind of being the Pied Piper to those who are enthusiasts of him, saying, okay, well, what's all the fuss about with some of these people? You know, what's all the fuss about with Cardi B? And then he does his research. Clearly he works hard at doing research for this stuff. And how many people over the last 6 weeks, or, you know, have you heard say, wow, I was so surprised about Cardi B? That's an episode where, hey, the Will Smith episode was great, but that guy's a giant already. And of course there's the, there's the controversy that's there, but let's put that aside. How many people have said, I didn't know that about Cardi B or Billie Eilish. I've heard that so much. And it's because Dave comes at it from his unique perspective, his gosh, golly, Midwestern sensibility and curiosity, and gives insight to so many people who only know these people at a passing glance, knowing that they're making an impact with the kids. And Dave shows why and shows us that depth of these people. It is remarkable to see. I want to get back to Seinfeld for a second, because I know we want to get to Comedians and Cars Getting Coffee as well, because that episode was also in my viewpoint very, very telling about the relationship between Dave and Jerry. I want to make sure we get there as well. Was there anything else about the mine before we move over to the Comedians and Cars and Dave's appearance there? Was there anything else in this episode on My Next Guest that we should touch on before we kind of merge over?
I guess not. No, I just as I had said, really the main thing that I took away from it was looking at Dave's contribution to the world and his contribution to making people happy. And some people might think about, okay, you're only helping people if you are volunteering with the Red Cross, or volunteering with Meals on Wheels, or the Humane Society. And those causes are great. Those are outstanding. Those are ways to help people. But also Jerry and Dave have helped people too. And just we have so much appreciation for what they've done as far as bringing happiness to the world, and that's priceless.
It's a great point. I'm glad Jerry, I've heard him bring it up in a couple different places. I'm glad he talks about that. Folks who make it big, or don't make it big for that matter, folks who use their artistic skills, their artistic license to impact people, whatever that looks like you talk about. Our world needs laughter right now. Anybody who can make somebody laugh, especially doing it, by the way, not getting political. They can do it in a benign way that includes kind of everybody, or if they are doing it, light poking of fun, that kind of a thing. Both Dave and Jerry are very good at that. Do you do any Trump stuff? No, I do raisin stuff. I love that entire segment of this episode. If you're going to go back and watch this My Next Guest, the idea Jerry deconstructing his Raisinets bit, really, really good. Talking about it in the club, more raisin stuff, just fantastic stuff. The fact that they put smiles on people's faces, or an artist that can evoke emotion, whether it's tears, whether it's self-reflection, all of these things cannot be understated, because we as a human, like, you look at how big the entertainment business is. It's literally built around doing that with our emotions, creating emotional responses, whatever those are. And the fact that and by the way, both men, I can't speak to Jerry as well as I can to Dave. Both men behind the scenes, for the right reasons, give to places like what you were talking about, the Red Cross or humanitarian type things. Dave's first project after going dark, when the Late Show when he retired from the Late Show, was the National Geographic special, talking about energy, talking about making the world a better place. You think about some of the guests he's had on, that's him using his pulpit to try and make the world a better place while entertaining. And I love that is something that he is focused on. I wish that he would see it the way Jerry sees it, though, that his main occupation also does that. It also makes the world a better place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that on your podcast with Scott Ryan, he brought that up. He would like to see more of Dave talking about the world's issues, what's going on in the world, climate change, or mental health or violence or different things like that. But at the same time, as you said, you don't want to get too political, because if you're too right wing or too left wing, you're going to turn off half of your audience.
You're going to
But you can
alienate.
talk about those things without necessarily saying, I'm 100% Republican or 100% Democrat, but you can definitely address those things that are happening in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I love how always Dave would come out and say, I'm a registered independent, and he'd call it like he saw it, and then the idea of just making fun of whoever's in the seat, and that was his job, doing that. Yeah, this is all such good stuff. And again, there's so much. Here's a good way to segue over to Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. This is one of the things. I'll tell you this. If there was a DVD or a Blu-ray box set of My Next Guest where there were extended cuts, this is the last thing I'll say about My Next Guest, then we'll move over to Comedians in Cars, because Dave has actually even commented about this one time when he interviewed Jerry about Jerry's show about Comedians in Cars, how important editing is. I'll tell you this. When my last watch of My Next Guest, the Seinfeld episode, I was watching the edits, and we've had some folks who have been to My Next Guest tapings, and how many of them are 90 minutes. The conversation itself, never mind with the video intercuts and things like that, the conversation itself, 90 minutes, and they get edited down. Obviously for time, and there's a formula to it, people's attention span and all that shit. But I felt that this episode had a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. Am I alone in that, or did you think that might be the case as well?
With Comedians in Cars, you mean? Or
no, My Next Guest. No, Comedians in Cars certainly had a lot of stuff on the floor, because Comedians in Cars is very much just the highlights. We're gonna just put the but I felt My Next Guest certainly had a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe they did, and like you said, maybe they could have like a DVD box set that would be the extended version, the director's cut or whatever, and I don't know, maybe it was a 2-hour interview that was cut down to 40 minutes or whatever. But no, I would be interested to know, everything that they did talk about. And with Comedians in Cars too, that's definitely edited down a lot. And so I would be interested to see the unedited cut of both of those shows. Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt. We had Irene Hoffman, Rupert's girlfriend, who's she was at the Tina Fey episode, and she said that Dave and Tina talked for about 90 minutes. She's going to come and do the postmortem on Tina Fey. And because she has a pretty good memory of many of the things that made the show versus that didn't make the show, and we're going to talk about that. Certainly, if there was somebody out there who was at the taping, and I mean, it's a long time ago. It's 2018. That was the other thing too. I talk about the dark years. Dave retired in 2015. This show came out in 2018. It wasn't that long, but boy, did it seem, because the world, as Scott Ryan talks about, he and I talk about that too, the world changed in 2016. And I think the passage of time changed as well, and the perception of time changed as well. The idea that this episode with Seinfeld, which to me was just so good, it was such a good episode, was only 3 years removed from when Dave retired, was very surprising to me. So anybody, I hope that this is a good commercial for people to go back and watch that episode. It was incredible. Now, and I would do exactly the same thing that Rob and I did. Rob was like, yeah, let's do the postmortem on Jerry, but let's also talk about Comedians in Cars a little bit. I loved that episode a lot, partially because we finally got to see, as a mass audience, as opposed to just a photograph here, maybe a small little video there, of Paul Newman's Volvo. Because we've heard Dave talk about that. I don't know how many times on the show Dave talked about Paul Newman's Volvo, but we heard it a lot. And again, you talk about one of these guys that a talk show host reveres, who thinks is real show business, you know, a giant. Paul Newman's that guy. Paul Newman, you know, tricked out this Volvo station wagon for fun and funny. And Dave chose that to be the car that got highlighted on Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. First off, that car, as far as I'm concerned, was a character in the show.
Sure. Oh, it certainly was. Yeah. They said it was 380 horsepower. It was tricked out by Paul Newman. Paul gave the car to Dave, and we know how much Dave looked up to Paul Newman. I mean, he was the first guest on The Late Show. He said, "Where the hell are the singing cats?" And so he had that famous line, and how can we forget Paul Newman? I mean, race car driver, movie star, and you want to talk about making a difference in the world. I mean, look at Paul Newman, not only through his acting, but even more through his charity work. I mean, his Paul Newman dressings and his other foods company, that he sold. Yep. He gave millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to charity. And so, yeah, Dave really looked up to Paul Newman. So it's just an outstanding show. I love Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee because I'm a car guy. I love cars. I love antique cars. I love classic cars. So that's why I said I love Jay Leno's Garage and all that stuff. And so it's just an awesome show because, I mean, they have a different car every episode, and Jerry kind of tries to tailor the car to who the comedian is. They talk comedy. They talk showbiz. They go and do a coffee shop, and it's a lot of the behind the scenes talk about comedy, you know, about the Comedy Store. The episode with Jay Leno is great. There's just so many episodes of that show that are just outstanding, and it's really one that people need to check out that enjoy comedy and showbiz stories, because it's so great in terms of behind the scenes stuff and comedy and showbiz.
Well, and before we get to that, you bring up a good point. A bunch of people around in my circle and I have been talking about legacy for a while now. You talk about, this is another one of those guys. Again, why start the Letterman podcast now? I'm aghast at how quickly people have forgotten Johnny Carson. Paul Newman's another guy where when you look at, Dreesen and I talked about this about Frank, you know, aghast at how quickly people have forgotten. And you listen to Tom get on his soapbox. It's so beautiful. Like I can't tell you how much I love it, because I relate to it. This is what I'm trying to do with Dave, and what not just we, all of us as a community who have these like-minded thoughts. This is a giant, and we're going to take the torch and we're going to pass it, because we don't want to see happen what's happened to Johnny happening to Frank. You know, Dreesen getting on his soapbox talking about how Frank Sinatra, the biggest star the world has ever seen, and he's got like 5 points as to boom, 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 boom. As far as he's concerned, it's open and shut. The greatest star who's ever lived, and there are so many people who don't even know who he is now. And when it comes to legacy, Paul Newman, same deal. You go to friggin' Costco, right? Arguably, brick and mortar's greatest volume store ever, and you can see Paul Newman's face on some of the products inside that store. We're talking millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of units sold every day. Is that Paul Newman's greatest legacy now? You know, and it is from a standpoint of that is still continuing to generate dollars for and make the world a better place. Awesome. What about the artistic legacy? And I think that we are so, and I say we, I'm saying you and I at this point, but also people who are involved in all of our communities are starting to recognize that. And when it comes to legacy, we do not want some of these people. Letterman, I do not ever want him to be forgotten, period. So let's get it going while these people are still alive and with us, and let's all celebrate it together and create this legacy phase while they're still here. I think Jerry is doing that with Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, because he is still relevant, and he's talking to some of these guys that are older, guys who are no longer with us. Thank God he has an episode with Norm Macdonald that we can go back and look at. Sure. And I think about even like, you know, I've been thinking legacy a lot, like that stand-up special that just came out, Norm's last special that he did just to camera. And then the panel afterwards with Chappelle and Letterman, Dave Squared, and Spade and Sandler and Molly and just legacy is a really, really important thing. And I think Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, while it is cleverly edited, they're short episodes, they're, it's a very important show. It's a legacy show. Man, I just went on a soapbox myself there. Thank you for listening to all that.
Well, it is a legacy show. I mean, Jerry had an episode with Jerry Lewis. I mean, one of his all-time comedy heroes, and I think that was not too long before Jerry passed away.
Yep.
But yeah, people can go back and look at these episodes, and Jerry, like a lot of other comedians, they do look to the past and they look at comedians who influenced them. He had an episode with Robert Klein, who was a huge influence on Jerry also. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of comedians are good about doing that. A lot of comedians are good at looking to the past and looking at, okay, I was influenced by Milton Berle or George Burns or Jack Benny or people like that. And that's great that they do that. I mean, because we have to acknowledge the comedy of today, but you need to look to the comedy of the past and how have they influenced people from today. I mean, you look at Johnny Carson was really influenced by Jack Benny, and you look at David Letterman was highly influenced by Johnny Carson, and you have the next generation. Jimmy Kimmel idolizes David Letterman. Jimmy Kimmel talks about growing up, he was all about David Letterman, so he's really patterned a lot of his show after Dave.
Exactly. And it is passing of torches in front of the camera. It's passing of torches behind the camera. It's passing of torches with the communities around that. Staying with Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, again, very telling. Jerry interviews Gary Shandling. Again, eerily close to when Gary unexpectedly passed. The boxing joke. I don't know if you remember the Gary Shandling episode, but you know what? The idea that, at my funeral, I want a boxing referee, because Gary Shandling famously, was an amateur or a recreational boxer, and I want a referee to come out 1, 2, 3, 4, and then to stop the count and say, he's not getting it, but just stop the count. And then like a few months later, Gary passes. But then Jerry has Judd Apatow on, and Judd, talk about mentor mentee. There's Gary Shandling's, kind of heir apparent. And I'm so glad that all of us are doing this with Dave now. I want Dave another 20, 30 years. Hey, technology, show up here and give us another 50 years of David Letterman. That's what I say. So we can get these communities going, and we can do that legacy justice, so we don't have what's happened with Carson and Jack Benny. Certainly Jack Benny. I mean, yeah, the kids at least have heard of Johnny Carson. Jack Benny, what does he even look like? So they're important shows, as well as entertaining and insightful. Dave showing up there on Comedians in Cars, it was, pre-beard, obviously. He's still doing the show at the time. It's before retirement. And I hope that there's a sequel. I hope Dave goes on Jerry's show again. Jerry's had a few repeat guests. I certainly hope that he goes on the show again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully he does. And, they talk about the Comedy Store, of course. And I know that you're the same way. I cannot hear enough about the Comedy Store in the 70s. And I wish that I had a time machine. I wish Back to the Future really existed. I could get in a DeLorean and go back to the Comedy Store and see David Letterman on stage, and see Freddie Prinze, and see Jay Leno and Tom Dreesen, and Jeff Altman and Jimmy Walker, and some of these amazing people.
Tim
Just
Thomerson.
Like I wish I could go back to NBC Burbank. I wish I could go back there and just walk the halls at NBC Burbank in like 1972, and Johnny Carson is taping over here. You have Laugh-In over here. You have the Flip Wilson Show. You have Midnight Special. You have Don Rickles is doing CPO Sharkey down here, and that would be just incredible.
Rob, like what you just are said and are doing, what I am attempting to do meagerly, what Don Giller has done, we are living examples of that. And I'm not saying that with an ounce of arrogance. I'm saying that with hope. What we're all trying to do is be that DeLorean. We're trying to, we're self-reflecting. I was once told that Gen X was the first generation in North America, certainly in the modern age, to actually have an intact childhood and to kind of keep it. And I totally believe that that is the case. And the fact that we're trying to be time machines for these things, again, no arrogance. Kind of like Jerry talking about, hey, Dave, guess what? We bring joy to the world. That's a good thing. We deserve to feel good for that. We go through hell to do that. We deserve to feel good about it. Kind of like that. It's a little bit of self-reflection as to how guys like you and I, in our own ways, I think about Jay Ryan. I think about, Scott Ryan as an author who's Bill Carter, these people who are documenting these things or whatever. We are the DeLorean, and it's up to us to do. I'm so passionate about it. That's why this show fucking exists, and why the idea of us doing a Letterman podcast network and all the things that we're talking about doing. I think about Rusty and the guys doing their podcast, and certainly Jay Ryan and Carson Comedy and all that. I think Seinfeld, because he's been doing comedians in cars for a long time. It's been around for a long time now. I think that that's his way of immortalizing and giving back and being that time machine for people. He's doing it for automobiles and comedians, by the way.
Mm-hmm. He is. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. You look at the cars and you look at comedians of the past, or you look at cars of the past. And he has talked about how a lot of the cars these days are just really boring. And he misses the days when cars were really unique, and you'd really see some creativity out there in the automakers and creativity in comedians too, some of the early comedians. But yeah, it's just a fantastic show. And Jerry and Dave go and walk around a hardware store. They talk about how Dave just loves just being in a hardware store, just the whole environment of it. So that was pretty funny.
I've had a lot of people talking to me about advice in the show, in this show, people who worked for Dave for years, and some people who have known him for years, and the idea of if or when I have a conversation with him and whatnot, and this is also instinctual to me. If I want to talk to Dave about the past, don't bring up, hey, remember that bit on late night? Hey, remember that bit on Late Show when you did this and did that? Like, be really, really careful with that when it's talking about nostalgia. And I want to ask him about nostalgia. That's a question that I have for him. That's one that I've already got in the hopper, ready to come out. I want to ask him about his vantage point about nostalgia, because it's fascinating to me. He even says it in the My Next Guest with Seinfeld. I'm not interested in revisiting bits that I've done in the past, whereas Jerry, came on Dave's show and did the entire first act that he originally did on late night, right at the very end. And Dave contrasted that by saying, I'm not interested in revisiting any material that I've done in the past, but talk to Dave about the days at the Comedy Store, the people at the Comedy Store, some of the memories of the Comedy Store, and yes, even the material said by him or some of his cohorts at the Comedy Store. Talking about George Miller. What was your favorite George Miller joke? Oh God, here we go. We're off to the races. Like, holy cow, there's a conversation I would have with him about that. And I know that it would be engaging and amazing, and I think it would be heartwarming for him, but that kind of a thing, that talking about that time is something that Dave is so open to doing and loves to do. And there's another reason, the depth of David Letterman. There's another thing that is fascinating. Don't talk to me about the nostalgia of anything I did, but the nostalgia of the Comedy Store, let's go all day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Dave probably looks back at that era as some of his glory days. And yes, he didn't have a lot of fame or money back then, but I think that a lot of people, they look back on early parts of their careers, the really formative years where they were really learning about their place in the world and meeting lots of other prominent comedians. And just, I don't know, I think that Dave looks back on that period with some reverence. Well, and we know he does. I mean, on his show, a lot of times he would have people on the show from back in those days. We know that he had Tom Dreesen on his NBC show and his CBS show a lot, and Jeff Altman and other people from that period. So that was a very important period in his life where he really learned a lot and just learned about the world in general, and of course the world of comedy.
Absolutely. God damn, I hate how slippery time is when we start doing this. You and I could do this all day and it's amazing. I love it. There's a couple little points I want to get to beforehand. You're a car guy, I'm a car guy. And we're also, comedy and all that. And I don't know if you've ever played this game or not. I certainly do with all of my quote unquote nerd friends. I'm into the comic books and all that other kind of stuff. What would ever happen if Thor fought Superman, and these dream scenarios and all that kind of stuff you bring up. I don't know. Have you ever daydreamed if you were ever to be on Comedians in Cars getting coffee, what car would you want featured in that episode? Have you ever made that thought connection?
Well, I mean, I think that definitely one of my ultimate classic cars is a car called a Duesenberg. And some people may not be familiar with the Duesenberg, but during the Depression era, the late 20s into the 30s, the Duesenberg was the ultimate luxury car. And they were, back then, a Duesenberg would cost $20,000. In 1929, it was $20,000. Keep in mind,
that's a Bugatti now.
Ford, a Model A Ford was $500. So you could buy 40 Model A Fords to add up to one Duesenberg. And they have, here in Michigan, there's a place called the Gilmore Car Museum. They have a 1929 Duesenberg on display that is just the ultimate in beauty and really a work of art. I mean, in the Depression era, Gary Cooper had a Duesenberg, and Cary Grant and the biggest stars of the day, that's what they drove. And Jay Leno has Duesenberg, so it's a classic car that is really unique. And I think that would be my ultimate car.
Outstanding. That's fantastic. Oh, by the way, Michigan guy, I've got a two-door Ford Bronco that's been on order forever, and there's a delay and all that. Could you go to the plant and see what the hell's going on for me? I'd really appreciate that. Definitely. I have to look into that. Yeah. Thank you for answering that. Duesenberg is a great answer. I love that. Before we, and this isn't going to be your last appearance again, we're in this thing for the long haul. We're in this thing to build communities. You are a community builder on social media when it comes to all these things that we're talking about. So by the way, Rob Cates on Facebook, the Rat Pack group, the Letterman fans group, the Comedy America group, all of these places. Rob's very accessible. He's also joined, come on board the Letterman podcast community, the Letterman podcast group on Facebook. You'll find Rob, and as we all start to interact with each other, let's build this community together. Thank you for being a community builder with the ones that you're doing. And I love how iron sharpens iron. We're sharpening each other. You're going to come back on the show and be a part of this more and more and more, right? Like I'm getting that confirmation on air. Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate, so much what you're doing. And, you've mentioned the other things going on. I'm excited about the, late night play set and what Jay Ryan is doing with that. And doing that show out of his house with Letterman's old set. And I know that you're producer, Mike, you're Canada, Mike, and you're involved with that. I love that show. I love, what Rusty's doing with Wake the Kids, Phone the Neighbors, and the whole Letterman podcast network that is building. It's just exciting to see, because all of us Letterman geeks kind of have a place to commune and talk about this stuff, which we're really passionate about. Oh, and to use the phrase that we're all sort of adopting here, and again tributing it, more to come, much more to come. As we kind of close up here, is there anything else that you wanted to kind of go over on either the My Next Guest or the Comedians and Cars Getting Coffee? If you had any other notes that you wanted to talk about before we wrap this one up and then move on to our next phase of things. Is there anything else you wanted to go over with Seinfeld and Letterman?
No, I guess not. I appreciate the chance to get get an opportunity to talk about two of my comedic heroes, Letterman and Seinfeld. And I just love seeing Letterman and Seinfeld together. I really enjoyed seeing Julia Louis-Dreyfus with Dave, and so then that whole Seinfeld connection, and I know how he looks up to her, and I mean he had her on his final show during being part of the top 10 list, and that Dave could choose any 10 people to be on there to do his final top 10 list, and so how much he looks up to Julia and Jerry. I mean, because both of them were 2 out of the 10 doing that final top 10 list. So it's just cool to see what's going on with Dave. And as you've mentioned, just the fact that Dave is still around, Dave is still doing things, he's still relevant. We have more and more people interested in David Letterman. I mean, we have the Letterman YouTube channel, we have your podcast, the other podcasts, and just it's kind of a resurgence in the interest of David Letterman right now, and it's great to see.
Oh, and thank God, 2022. It's a good time to be a David Letterman fan. I've said that before. Did we ever think that would be the case? Thank God that we can say it. Couldn't have wrapped it up better myself. That is another episode of the Post-Mortem. I will wrap it up in a specific way in a moment here. We just want to thank everybody. I want to thank Rob Cates for being on here again. First repeat guest, and I'm glad it's you, man. Again, mad respect. In the trail of breadcrumbs that led to this show, which is going to lead to other stuff. We just don't know necessarily what that is yet. What those things are yet, but in the trail of breadcrumbs that led to this show, your site, your David Letterman fan page was pivotal in many ways, and I'll get into that maybe another day a little bit, but thank you so much. I love that you are our first repeat guest. That is fantastic. Thank you to our sponsor, the Hello Deli. Rupert and May are doing some great things over there. Rupert G is just he's a legend himself, even though, again, talk about a guy who just deflects compliments like a ninja, but again, a legend to us, and it's amazing to be doing things with Rupert. So thank you to the Hello Deli, of course. I wrote a book with my wife a few years ago, and it's a personal development book. We went through a struggle with our granddaughter. She's all good now, but she was an infant at the time, and we spent a bunch of time at Children's Hospital. And my wife and I learned a bunch of things through that book, through writing, through that experience, and we wrote it in a book from her perspective versus my perspective. And we released that book. The very first time that somebody came up to me with a copy of our book and said, "Hey, Mike, can you sign this to me?" The inscription I put in was the way that Dave left the Seinfeld episode on My Next Guest. It's my favorite. Some people say cheers, some people say kind regards when they finish a letter. I say this often, and Dave said it. I don't know where he got it from, but it's my favorite way to sign off with somebody, with a smile on my face, but also serious, because I'm a huge music fan. Dave finished that show. Jerry and Dave are waving to the crowd, and normally I finish the show by saying thank you and good night, because that's a rally point for me. Thank you and good night. The last Letterman jacket, all of that. That's the last thing Dave said on the Late Show. That's not how we're ending this episode. We're ending this episode with, actually, in my opinion, the most clever way to sign off. And I mean, I've built it up way too much, and people are just going to be like, "Oh, so disappointed," probably, but it doesn't matter. I'm a huge music guy. And that night, when Dave and Jerry are waving to the audience. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dave said something, and that's how we're going to sign off today. So this is an episode of the Postmortem of Jerry Seinfeld, the Letterman podcast with special guest Rob Cates. My name is Mike Chisholm. May all your favorite bands stay together. Goodbye, everybody.
Overcoat and underpants.